That security guard had no idea that the entire plan for that night would be heavily guarded. He couldn't have predicted that it would not only ruin protocol, but also his own career and international relations, because the woman he thought was his personal person was actually. The United Nations headquarters building stood majestically against the evening Manhattan skyline, its distinctive glass and steel facade reflecting the lights of the city, as diplomats, government officials, and international dignitaries gathered for one of the year's most significant diplomatic receptions. The 38th floor reception hall had been transformed into an elegant venue befitting the importance of the evening's gathering, a commemoration of the International Day of Peace that would bring together ambassadors, ministers, and representatives from over 50 nations. The hall itself was a masterpiece of international diplomacy made manifest in architecture and design. Flags of member nations hung in precise alphabetical order along the walls, their vibrant colors creating a tapestry of global unity. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over mahogany tables adorned with white roses and subtle gold accents, while floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking views of the East River and the twinkling lights of Queens beyond. Security for the evening was comprehensive and multi-layered, as befitted an event hosting such high-level international figures. Multiple agencies coordinated their efforts: the UN Security and Safety Service, the U.S. State Department's Diplomatic Security Service, the NYPD's Intelligence Division, and the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force. Every entrance was monitored, every guest list verified multiple times, and every security protocol executed with precision that came from years of protecting the world's most important diplomatic gatherings. At the main security checkpoint near the 42nd Street entrance, Thomas Mitchell stood at his assigned position, checking credentials and ensuring that only authorized personnel and invited guests gained access to the reception area. At 34, Thomas had worked in private security for over 8 years, most recently specializing in high-profile events and VIP protection. His resume included work at corporate headquarters, luxury hotels, and exclusive private clubs, but tonight's UN reception represented the pinnacle of his professional experience. Thomas took considerable pride in his attention to detail and his ability to spot potential security risks before they became problems. He had studied the guest list extensively, memorized the faces of key dignitaries who would be attending, and reviewed security protocols until he could recite them from memory. In his mind, he was the last line of defense between the international community and anyone who might wish to disrupt this important gathering. What Thomas didn't fully appreciate, however, was the complex web of diplomatic protocol that governed events like tonight's reception. His experience with corporate security had taught him to think in terms of clear hierarchies and obvious status markers: expensive suits, luxury accessories, recognizable titles, and the kind of obvious wealth that announced itself through material display. The nuanced world of international diplomacy operated according to different rules, where true power often moved quietly, and where assumptions based on appearance could lead to catastrophic misunderstandings. As the evening progressed and the reception hall filled with elegantly dressed diplomats and officials, Thomas maintained his vigilant watch at the security checkpoint. He had processed dozens of guests without incident, each presenting their invitation, submitting to security screening, and proceeding to the reception area with the smooth efficiency that marked well-organized diplomatic events. It was at approximately 7:45 p.m. when Ambassador Dr. Amara Okonkwo approached the security checkpoint. At 43, Dr. Okonkwo was one of the youngest and most accomplished diplomats in the United Nations system, having served her country with distinction for over 15 years in various international postings. Her current role as permanent representative to the United Nations represented the culmination of a career dedicated to peacebuilding, conflict resolution, and international cooperation. Dr. Okonkwo's journey to this position had been neither traditional nor easy. Born in a small village in West Africa, she had earned her way to university through academic excellence and determination, eventually obtaining advanced degrees in international relations and international law from prestigious institutions in Europe and the United States. Her doctoral dissertation on post-conflict reconstruction had become required reading in diplomatic academies around the world, and her practical experience in peace negotiations had earned her respect from colleagues across the political spectrum. Tonight, Dr. Okonkwo had chosen to dress in a way that honored both her cultural heritage and the formal nature of the diplomatic gathering. As Dr. Okonkwo approached Thomas's security checkpoint, she was reviewing her prepared remarks for the evening's formal program on her smartphone, making minor adjustments to ensure that her comments would appropriately acknowledge the various diplomatic priorities represented in the room. She carried a small black leather portfolio containing her speech notes, along with briefing materials on several ongoing international issues that might arise in conversation during the reception. Thomas looked up from his security screening station as Dr. Okonkwo approached, and his trained eye immediately began the automatic assessment that his experience had taught him to make of every person who entered his sphere of responsibility. What he saw didn't immediately match his mental template of what a high-level diplomatic guest should look like. While Dr. Okonkwo's clothing was clearly of good quality and appropriate for the occasion, it didn't carry the obvious luxury brand markers that Thomas had learned to associate with wealth and importance. Her accessories were minimal and understated, rather than ostentatious. Her manner of dress, while professional and elegant, reflected cultural traditions that Thomas didn't immediately recognize or understand. Most significantly, she was approaching the checkpoint alone, without the entourage of staff members and security personnel that typically surrounded the most important diplomatic figures. "Good evening, Doctor," Okonkwo said with the warm professionalism that had served her well in diplomatic settings around the world. "I'm here for the International Day of Peace reception." Thomas nodded and extended his hand in the universal gesture for credentials. "Invitation and identification, please." Dr. Okonkwo reached into her portfolio and withdrew a formal invitation printed on heavy cream-colored paper with the United Nations seal embossed in gold, along with her diplomatic passport, a distinctive maroon document that identified her as a representative of her nation with full diplomatic immunity and privileges. Thomas examined the invitation first, noting that it was clearly authentic and properly formatted. However, as his eyes moved to the name printed on the invitation, he frowned slightly. The invitation was addressed to His Excellency Dr. Amara Okonkwo, Permanent Representative, but Thomas had unconsciously expected diplomatic titles to be held by men, particularly from African nations where his limited knowledge suggested that women might not hold such high positions. "Is this your invitation?" Thomas asked, his tone carrying a subtle note of skepticism that Dr. Okonkwo immediately recognized, but chose not to address directly. "Yes, it is, Doctor." Okonkwo replied simply, maintaining her professional composure despite the implied question about whether she was somehow using someone else's invitation improperly. Thomas then examined the diplomatic passport, but his unfamiliarity with diplomatic documents led him to misinterpret what he was seeing. While he recognized that it was some form of official government document, he didn't immediately understand the significance of the diplomatic passport or the legal immunities and privileges it represented. In his experience, important people carried expensive-looking items that clearly announced their status, and the practical, understated appearance of the diplomatic passport didn't match his expectations. "And you are?" Thomas asked, still holding both documents but clearly expecting additional explanation or clarification. Dr. Okonkwo maintained her professional smile, though those who knew her well would have recognized the slight tightening around her eyes that indicated her patience was being tested. "I am Dr. Amara Okonkwo, Permanent Representative of my country to the United Nations." Thomas glanced at the diplomatic passport again, then looked back at Dr. Okonkwo with an expression that suggested he was not entirely convinced by her explanation. "You're saying you're an ambassador?" The question was asked in a tone that carried clear skepticism, and Dr. Okonkwo felt the familiar sting of having her qualifications questioned based on assumptions about her appearance, her gender, or her cultural background. It was not the first time in her diplomatic career that she had encountered such attitudes, and her experience had taught her that direct confrontation was rarely the most effective response in such situations. "That is correct, Doctor," Okonkwo replied calmly. "I am the permanent representative, which is the equivalent rank to ambassador in the United Nations system." Thomas continued to hold her documents while studying her face, as if trying to reconcile what he was seeing with his preconceived notions about what diplomatic officials should look like. "I'm going to need to verify this with my supervisor," he said finally. Dr. Okonkwo's expression remained neutral, but she felt a flash of irritation at the suggestion that her properly issued diplomatic credentials required additional verification. "These are official documents issued by my government and recognized by the United Nations and the United States State Department," she said quietly. "I'm not sure what additional verification would be necessary." Thomas, however, had convinced himself that something about the situation didn't feel right. In his mind, truly important diplomatic figures should be accompanied by staff members, should carry themselves with more obvious authority, and should dress in ways that immediately announce their status and importance. Dr. Okonkwo's understated approach to both dress and demeanor struck him as inconsistent with his expectations about how ambassadors should present themselves. "Look, miss," Thomas said, his tone taking on a slightly condescending quality, "I'm sure you understand that we have to be very careful about security at events like this. There are a lot of important people here tonight, and we can't just take everyone's word for who they say they are." The implication that Dr. Okonkwo was not herself an important person was clear, and she felt her diplomatic training being tested in ways that her years of international negotiations had prepared her to handle. "I certainly understand the importance of security," she replied evenly. "However, I believe you'll find that my credentials are entirely in order." Thomas glanced around the security checkpoint area, looking for his supervisor, but the evening's busy schedule meant that senior security personnel were occupied with other responsibilities. "I'm going to have to ask you to wait here while I get this sorted out," he said, still holding Dr. Okonkwo's invitation and diplomatic passport. Dr. Okonkwo felt her patience beginning to fray, but she maintained her diplomatic composure. "How long do you anticipate this verification process will take?" Thomas shrugged, a gesture that conveyed his indifference to her schedule or the importance of her presence at the reception. "As long as it takes. Like I said, we have to be careful." At this point, other guests had begun to notice that something unusual was happening at the security checkpoint. A line was beginning to form behind Dr. Okonkwo as Thomas continued to hold her documents without allowing her to proceed. Several distinguished-looking diplomats and officials waited patiently, but their presence seemed to increase Thomas's nervousness about making a decision regarding Dr. Okonkwo's credentials. Dr. Sarah Whitmore, the Deputy Chief of Protocol for the United Nations, was making her routine rounds of the reception area when she noticed the unusual delay at the security checkpoint. Dr. Whitmore was a career diplomat with over 20 years of experience in international protocol, and she immediately recognized both the potential for diplomatic incident and the need to resolve whatever issue was causing the delay. "Is there a problem here?" Dr. Whitmore asked as she approached the checkpoint, her tone professional but carrying the authority of someone accustomed to resolving complex diplomatic situations. Thomas turned toward Dr. Whitmore with obvious relief, clearly hoping that someone with apparent authority could help him navigate the situation. "I'm trying to verify this woman's credentials," he said, gesturing toward Dr. Okonkwo. "She claims to be an ambassador, but I want to make sure everything checks out." Dr. Whitmore's eyes widened slightly as she recognized Dr. Okonkwo, whom she had worked with on numerous occasions and regarded as one of the most competent and respected diplomats in the UN system. "This is Dr. Amara Okonkwo," Dr. Whitmore said, her voice carrying a note of surprise and concern. "She is indeed the permanent representative of her country to the United Nations." Thomas looked back and forth between the two women, clearly confused by this confirmation of Dr. Okonkwo's identity. "But she doesn't look like," he began, then stopped himself as he realized that completing that sentence would reveal the assumptions and biases that had led him to question her credentials in the first place. Dr. Whitmore's expression grew stern as she began to understand what had transpired. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, reading his name tag. "Dr. Okonkwo is not only a permanent representative, but she is also one of the evening's featured speakers. She is scheduled to deliver remarks during tonight's formal program." The weight of his mistake began to settle on Thomas like a physical burden. He had not only questioned the credentials of a legitimate diplomatic guest, but he had delayed and potentially humiliated one of the evening's most important participants. I was just following security protocols," he stammered. Dr. Okonkwo, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand the importance of security protocols. However, I'm curious about what specific aspect of my credentials or my appearance led you to believe that additional verification was necessary." Thomas felt his face flush as he realized that Dr. Okonkwo was diplomatically but clearly asking him to explain the basis for his suspicions. Well, I just wanted to be thorough," he said weakly. "Thorough," Dr. Okonkwo repeated, her tone remaining calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. "And do you typically require additional verification when other diplomatic officials present their credentials?" Thomas found himself unable to answer, knowing that any explanation would reveal the unconscious biases and assumptions that had led him to single out Dr. Okonkwo for special scrutiny. Dr. Whitmore watched the exchange with growing concern, recognizing that what had begun as a security misunderstanding was rapidly evolving into a potential diplomatic incident. "Dr. Okonkwo," Dr. Whitmore said, stepping forward to defuse the situation, "please allow me to personally escort you to the reception area. I sincerely apologize for this delay." Dr. Okonkwo accepted her credentials back from Thomas, who handed them over with hands that were now visibly trembling. "Thank you, Dr. Whitmore," she said graciously. "However, I think it might be beneficial to address this situation more comprehensively." Dr. Whitmore felt a chill of apprehension as she recognized the diplomatic language that often preceded formal complaints and international incidents. "Dr. Okonkwo, I assure you that this was simply a misunderstanding." "Was it?" Dr. Okonkwo asked quietly. "Because from my perspective, it appears that I was subjected to additional scrutiny and questioning based on assumptions about my appearance, my nationality, or my gender. That's not a misunderstanding. That's discrimination." Thomas realized that his attempt to be thorough had instead created exactly the kind of diplomatic crisis that security protocols were designed to prevent. "Ambassador Okonkwo," he said, using her proper title for the first time, "I sincerely apologize. I made a mistake." Dr. Okonkwo studied his face for a moment, evaluating his sincerity and considering her response. "Mr. Mitchell, your apology is noted. However, this incident raises concerns that extend beyond individual mistakes. It suggests systemic issues with how security personnel are trained to recognize and respect diplomatic credentials and privileges." She turned to Dr. Whitmore. "I believe this matter warrants formal review by the appropriate authorities. Diplomatic immunity and privileges exist for important reasons, and any compromise of those protections undermines the effectiveness of international cooperation." Dr. Whitmore nodded grimly, understanding that Dr. Okonkwo was absolutely correct and that the incident would likely require formal reporting and investigation. "Of course, Dr. Okonkwo. I will ensure that this matter receives appropriate attention." As word of the incident began to spread through the reception area, the potential ramifications became increasingly clear. Other diplomats who learned of the situation expressed concern about the implications for diplomatic protocol and security procedures. The incident threatened to overshadow the evening's celebration of international peace and cooperation, instead highlighting tension. Thomas found himself isolated at his security checkpoint, realizing that his actions had not only embarrassed himself, but had potentially damaged relationships between nations and institutions that had taken years to build. His supervisor, when finally located and informed of the situation, was both appalled by the diplomatic implications and concerned about the security company's reputation and future contracts. The incident would ultimately lead to comprehensive reviews of security protocols, enhanced training for personnel working with international dignitaries, and formal diplomatic consultations to address the concerns raised by Dr. Okonkwo's treatment. Thomas himself would face disciplinary action and would likely find his career in high-level security work effectively ended. Dr. Okonkwo, meanwhile, proceeded to deliver her planned remarks about the importance of mutual respect and understanding in international relations, though the evening's events had given her words a particular poignancy and relevance that resonated deeply with the diplomatic audience. In the weeks that followed, the incident would serve as a case study in diplomatic protocol training programs, illustrating how quickly assumptions and biases could escalate into international incidents, and how crucial it was for all personnel involved in diplomatic events to understand and respect the principles of diplomatic immunity and privilege. The evening that had begun as a celebration of international peace had instead become a stark reminder that true peace required not just formal agreements between nations, but also genuine respect and understanding between individuals, regardless of their background, appearance, or the assumptions others might make about their place in the world. Over the following 48 hours, the ramifications of Thomas's actions would ripple through multiple levels of government and international organizations. The UN Secretary-General's office requested a full report on the incident, while Dr. Okonkwo's government formally expressed its concerns through diplomatic channels. The security company that employed Thomas faced immediate contract review, and several other diplomatic missions inquired about security protocols to ensure their own representatives would not face similar treatment. Thomas found himself called into his supervisor's office the next morning, where he faced not only immediate termination, but also the knowledge that his actions had jeopardized his company's relationships with multiple international organizations. His supervisor, Margaret Chen, had worked in diplomatic security for over 15 years and understood the gravity of what had occurred. "Thomas," Margaret said, her voice heavy with disappointment, "in all my years managing security for diplomatic events, I have never encountered such a serious breach of protocol. You didn't just question someone's credentials. You questioned the legitimacy of a sitting UN ambassador based on your personal assumptions about what diplomats should look like." Thomas sat quietly, finally understanding the full scope of his mistake. "I thought I was being thorough," he said weakly. "Thorough?" Margaret replied. "Thomas, thoroughness in diplomatic security means understanding and respecting the documents and protocols that govern international relations. It means recognizing that diplomats come from every nation, every culture, and every background. Your actions demonstrated not thoroughness, but ignorance of the very principles you were hired to protect." She placed a formal termination letter on the desk between them. "This incident will be reported to every major security firm in the city. Your career in high-level security work is effectively over." Meanwhile, Dr. Okonkwo was conducting her own review of the incident with her senior staff at the mission. Her deputy chief of mission, Ambassador Sarah Kamathi, had worked with Dr. Okonkwo for over 5 years and had witnessed her navigate complex diplomatic challenges with skill and grace. But this incident was different. It struck at the fundamental principles of diplomatic immunity and mutual respect that made international cooperation possible. "Ambassador," Sarah said during their morning briefing, "the response from other missions has been remarkable. Over 20 permanent representatives have reached out to express their support and their own concerns about security protocols." Dr. Okonkwo nodded thoughtfully. "This incident affects more than just our mission, Sarah. If security personnel at international events feel empowered to question diplomatic credentials based on personal biases," she stood and walked to the window of her office, which offered a view of the East River and the city beyond. "I've been thinking about the young diplomats in our program, particularly the women from developing nations who will face challenges like this throughout their careers. We have an obligation to address this systematically, not just for ourselves, but for the next generation of international leaders. Dr. Okonkwo's response to the incident would become a model for how diplomatic professionals could address discrimination while maintaining the dignity and effectiveness of international relations. Rather than simply filing a complaint and moving on, she worked with UN protocol to develop enhanced training programs for security personnel, created guidelines for recognizing and respecting diverse diplomatic credentials, and established a reporting system for similar incidents. The training program that emerged from Dr. Okonkwo's initiative would eventually be adopted by security companies throughout the New York diplomatic community and later adapted for use at international organizations around the world. The curriculum included modules on cultural sensitivity, recognition of diplomatic documents from various nations, and the legal and practical importance of diplomatic immunity. Thomas, meanwhile, struggled to find new employment as word of the incident spread through the security industry. The diplomatic security field was relatively small, and his actions at the UN reception had become known to most major employers. He eventually found work in a much lower-level security position, but the experience had fundamentally changed his understanding of his own biases and assumptions. 6 months after the incident, Thomas wrote a letter to Dr. Okonkwo, not seeking forgiveness or employment assistance, but expressing his genuine understanding of how his actions had reflected deeper problems in his thinking and in the systems that trained security personnel. The letter was thoughtful and demonstrated real personal growth, acknowledging not just his mistake, but the underlying attitudes that had led to it. Dr. Okonkwo, after consulting with her staff, decided to respond to Thomas's letter. Her response was gracious but firm, acknowledging his apparent growth while emphasizing that the real measure of change would be in how he applied his new understanding to prevent similar incidents in the future. Dr. Okonkwo's handling of the situation earned her recognition not just for her individual grace under pressure, but for her ability to transform a negative experience into positive systemic change. The International Association of Women Diplomats honored her with their annual Leadership Award, recognizing her efforts to address discrimination while advancing the broader goals of international cooperation. The reception hall where the incident had occurred was eventually renamed the International Dignity and Respect Conference Center, with a plaque commemorating the importance of treating all diplomatic representatives with appropriate honor, regardless of their background or appearance. A year later, Dr. Okonkwo was invited to deliver the keynote address at the annual Diplomatic Security Conference, where she spoke to an audience of security professionals, protocol officers, and diplomatic personnel about the lessons learned from the incident. Her speech, titled "Security Through Respect: Protecting Dignity in International Relations," became required reading for diplomatic security training programs. True security in international relations, Dr. Okonkwo told the conference, comes not from walls and barriers, but from mutual respect and understanding. When we fail to recognize the dignity and authority of diplomatic representatives, we don't just harm individuals, we weaken the entire foundation of international cooperation. She continued, "The security guard who questioned my credentials that evening was not acting out of malice, but out of ignorance and unconscious bias. The solution is not to condemn such individuals, but to educate them and to create systems that prevent such incidents from occurring in the future." The impact of Dr. Okonkwo's approach extended beyond the immediate diplomatic community. Her case became a study in conflict resolution programs at universities around the world, demonstrating how individuals could respond to discrimination in ways that created positive change rather than simply seeking personal vindication. The United Nations itself implemented new procedures for diplomatic events, including enhanced training for all security personnel and clear protocols for handling any questions about diplomatic credentials. The changes were incorporated into the UN's official guidelines for international. Dr. Okonkwo's career continued to flourish in the years following the incident. Her reputation for handling difficult situations with grace and effectiveness led to her appointment as President of the UN General Assembly, making her one of the most influential diplomats on the world stage. In her acceptance speech for that position, she referenced the security checkpoint incident as an example of how challenges could become opportunities for positive change. That evening at the UN reception, she said, I faced a choice. I could respond with anger and demand immediate personal satisfaction, or I could use the incident as a catalyst for broader change that would benefit not just myself, but all diplomats who might face similar challenges in the future. I chose the path that served the greater good, and I believe that choice has made our international community stronger and more inclusive. Thomas, meanwhile, had used his experience as motivation for personal and professional growth. He eventually became an advocate for diversity and inclusion training in the security industry, speaking at conferences and training sessions about the importance of recognizing and overcoming unconscious bias. His transformation from perpetrator to advocate became another positive outcome of the incident. The story of that evening at the United Nations would continue to resonate for years to come, serving as a reminder that individual actions, no matter how small they might seem at the time, could have far-reaching consequences for international relations and global cooperation. It demonstrated that true leadership meant not just demanding respect for oneself, but creating systems and cultures that ensured respect for all. The true lesson of that evening was that diplomacy began not with formal negotiations between governments, but with the basic human courtesy and respect that individuals showed to one another, especially when those individuals represented different cultures, backgrounds, and ways of understanding the world. And sometimes, as Thomas learned to his lasting regret, the cost of failing to show that basic respect could extend far beyond individual embarrassment to affect relationships between nations and the broader cause of international peace and cooperation. But sometimes, as Dr. Okonkwo demonstrated, those same failures could become opportunities for creating lasting positive change that would benefit generations of future diplomats and international leaders. And that's how one security guard's assumptions nearly created an international diplomatic incident. Sometimes the most important protocols aren't written in manuals. They're about treating every person with the dignity and respect they deserve, especially when they represent something bigger than themselves. If this story made you think about the power of respect and the dangers of making assumptions based on appearance, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories about dignity, accountability, and the importance of understanding that true authority often comes in unexpected forms. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that challenges us to see beyond